purpose of tonight's presentation is to provide context around the 26-27 preliminary budget that the board approved in January. At that time, the board also authorized the district to apply an Act 1 exception, which provides flexibility beyond the 3.5%. This is the same process we do every year. Although we apply for exceptions annually, we have rarely qualified for them. Tonight, I'll walk through the financial factors shaping the budget and how the district is approaching the process. It's important to note that the final tax rate will not be determined until the final budget adoption in June. So what is an Act 1 exception? Under Act 1, school districts may raise property taxes up to the annual Act 1 index, which is calculated by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and it varies year to year. So for the 26-27 school year, the tax rate is 3.5%. However, the law recognizes that some mandated costs can increase faster than the index. When that happens, districts can apply to the Pennsylvania Department of Education for specific exceptions. Those exceptions are school construction, special education expenditures, and retirement contributions. This process allows districts to seek flexibility without requiring a referendum, which means no public vote is required. And for the 26-27 school year, our district did qualify for the special education exception, which allows us to increase the tax rate up to a 6.19%. So why an exception may be considered? As I mentioned before, we qualify for the special ed exception. On this slide, you'll notice a 5-year breakdown of our costs. You will notice some year-to-year fluctuations. This is typical and is driven by the individualized needs of students. Costs vary based on the number of students requiring high-cost services, out-of-district placements, changes in required staffing or support services, and just 1 or 2 high-cost placements can significantly impact the total expenditures in a given year. Among other factors, our district expenditures do continue to grow faster than our recurring revenue. About 75% of our budget is contractually obligated, which means there's very limited flexibility to reduce those costs. The largest drivers of these costs are mainly salaries and healthcare, followed by pensions and special education services. While the district has implemented several cost containment measures, even with those efforts, the revenue generated at that Act 1 index alone does not fully close the remaining gap. So where does all the money go? Well, like I mentioned before, 75% of our expenditures are tied to personnel, which is salary and benefits. 17% is non-personnel expenses such as contracted services, transportation, utilities, maintenance, and supplies. And 5% is our debt service. This helps illustrate why our school budget can be difficult to adjust since the majority of expenses are tied to personnel. Now, where does our funding come from? Our revenue is mostly local. 84% of our revenue is local revenue. Out of that 84%, 70% is for property taxes. The remaining 14% is our variable revenue, which is earned income taxes, transfer taxes, and investment earnings. Another 16% is state funded, which comes from basic ed funding, special ed funding, and other state subsidies. And then as you can see, a whopping 1% is our federal revenue. The next couple slides are going to talk about per pupil costs, and this is because there's been a bit of confusion with how it's calculated. Majority of people believe you take the total amount of expenditures and divide it by the number of students, and that is just simply not the case. For comparison purposes, the Department of Education does publish a standardized per pupil figure under ESSA federal guidelines so that it is consistent throughout the state. For the 23-24 school year, New Hope-Solebury's per pupil spending under that calculation is $22,448. This is a complex calculation that excludes debt service, construction projects, transportation, transfers between funds, certain contracted services that are not directly related to student education, and other factors. It is designed to measure classroom and operating spending directly related to educating students. The next slide is the file that is pulled from PDE. The reason the state publishes this information is to allow for an apples to apples comparison between districts. The same calculation is applied statewide, the same categories are included and excluded, and the information comes directly from each district's annual financial report that is submitted to Department of Education. So this provides a consistent and transparent way to compare spending across districts. So before looking at the budget numbers themselves, I think it's important to highlight the areas the district has taken to control costs. These are all items and areas that we focused on in the past year to help contain costs. So a lot of it included staffing adjustments, operational efficiencies, and special ed changes. We also pursued new revenue sources such as grants, partnerships, and facility revenue opportunities. These actions have certainly helped reduce the gap, but they did not eliminate it entirely. So this slide provides a snapshot of where we are with the preliminary 26-27 budget. The current projection includes approximately 54.9 million in revenue and 55.9 million in expenditures, leaving a remaining gap of about 1 million. And these figures are assuming a 6% tax increase. Now, a 3.5% tax increase generates about 1.2 million in revenue. The exception provides an additional 980,000 of revenue flexibility. If we were to remain at the 3.5%, that $1 million gap would become a $2 million gap. So what does this mean for the average median taxpayer? For this school year, the millage rate is 120.5, which equates to about $6,600 school bill. If we were to raise taxes up to 6%, the millage rate changes to 127.9, and the new tax bill is about $7,000, which is an increase of about $400 a year or $33 a month. Now, if you look at a different perspective, the average median assessed home of 54,000 is equivalent to a home worth 900,000. So $900,000 home in New Hope is paying about 6,600 a year in school taxes, while the same $900,000 house in Council Rock is paying $7,900 a year, and in Central Bucks about $8,000 a year. And compare Bucks County or millage rate to Bucks County, we are among the lowest where that arrow is, and we're side by side with Palisades. And the next school district with the lowest millage rate is Penridge at 140. So as you can see, it's a 20 millage point of difference from the next lowest. And even if we were to raise taxes to 6%, our new millage rate would be 127. And then Penridge is going to most likely raise their taxes, and we're still way under that. If you want to compare us to the state, there's another calculation called the equalized millage. And when you do that, our millage rate statewide is 7 mills, which ranks us 37 out of 410 single county districts, and it ranks us in the lowest 9% statewide. The statewide millage rate is 10.15 mills. And this is the bar graph showing us as the lowest in Bucks County again, and well below the state median of 10. And we've seen this slide before. It's Mr. Augenblick's slide, and I'll let him talk a little bit about it since he knows.
Sure, thanks, Marcia. I'll walk up front, just because I know from the back room, it can be hard to see. So I don't actually think there are too many people in the stream that haven't seen this before or haven't had me walk through this before. But I do want to recontextualize it, and I'll kind of start at the end point. So if we were to go back to the beginning of the COVID era and just look at 3 different metrics, right? One of which would be, hey, what was inflation? What was the CPI, right? Just inflation that all of us face. And we could look at what was the Act One index over that time period. Then we could look at how much did the New Hope-Solebury School District raise taxes during that time period. Right, so kind of three indicators to see, all right, over a long period of time, what was the economic experience of the residents of New Hope-Solebury School District? So to say it succinctly, if you had a $10,000 expense in 2020, and you just look at what inflation is for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, today that $10,000 to buy $10,000 worth of stuff today costs you $13,214. If we were just to take the Act One index, and if the district just blindly subscribed to it and just pushed the button every year to say, hey, we're going to raise taxes, the Act One index, if you had a $10,000 tax bill at the beginning of the 2020-2021 budget cycle, you'd be looking at $12,900 today. So $12,900 is less than $13,200, so less than inflation if you just hit the Act One index button. By looking uniquely at the district's finances on an iterative but also strategic basis, and you look at the actual tax increases, even if we went all the way up to the limit of 6.19%, that's the Act One plus the exceptions, that bill of $10,000 today would be $12,500. So I'll say this in one sentence. Even if we increase taxes all the way to 6.19%, the experience of a resident in terms of the increased taxes they actually pay is less than inflation and less than the Act One index cumulatively over that time period. And what you're seeing here is the benefit of what I'll say a cohesive and long duration leadership, right? The same people that were around the table back here in 2020 and 2021 from the leadership standpoint, and the administration are still here today. And many of the folks at this table are still here today. So you've had continuity of strategy. And it was actually, I think, a really interesting piece of the Q&A from the Finance Committee meeting. There was a thoughtful question, I think it was Ms. Frapwell who asked it. She said, well, why do we have a $2 million gap? Right, it's a very thoughtful question, right? Why do we have a $2 million structural gap in the district? And the answer I gave that night, I think, was somewhat fragmented. I said, well, because there are items that the district has to pay that have increased faster than the Act One index and faster than our structural increases. And those things are just the benefits, right? If you look at health insurance or transportation, 17.5% increase of that contract. There are some kind of known offenders, big needle movers. But after I had time to actually think about that question more thoughtfully, I actually would have pulled this slide back up. And I would say, well, I know why there's a $2 million structural gap today. It's because we made the intentional decision when inflation was at 5 and 9% back coming out of COVID to only raise taxes by 1 or 2%. And everything that we needed to buy during this time period was going up by more than 1 or 2%. But it was the right thing to do to take advantage of short-term reserves, to take advantage of short-term phenomena, to not go all the way up to the Act One index in those years. And that's why there's a structural gap today. It's not a surprise to people that have been here for a long period of time. And so wherever the tax increase lands, even if it ends up at 6.19%, it's a culmination of an economic cycle and decisions intentionally that were made in the past. And I also try to put myself in the shoes of a taxpayer who just kind of wandered into the district this year, right? Remember, they've never seen this data. I remember not thinking about this in a multi-year horizon. And they just moved from sub-state and they come in here and all of a sudden they're like, holy smokes, my taxes went up by 6.19%. And I get that. It's a very visceral thing to feel that. And I said in the Finance Committee meeting that, man, I wish we could raise taxes by 0% every year. I wish we could. But the reality is that everything we need to buy costs more every year. And you see what long-term disciplined finance gets you to, which is when you have a long-term perspective, an increase in taxes that's lower than the Act One index, lower than inflation, and we still have the best ratio of home value to unit of property tax, as Marcia showed, right, in the county, right? And when I think about that, you step back across the room from that, there's just no other way to look at that than a huge win. So that's kind of the story that's buried in this data. And it's important to not look at things in a one-year picture, but over a multi-year horizon as part of a greater strategy. And so that's kind of the short version of what we talked about in the finance committee. And I do also just want to say that Marcia has prepared, it's not even just a presentation, right? It's really more of an analysis that is more thoughtful, more thorough than anything that I've seen in my tenure here as either a board member or even like a random finance committee member like back in 2008, 2009. So it's really cool to see Marcia again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for presenting the slide. Okay, moving on to our budget timeline. We begin the process very early on in the school year. It starts in October, November, gathering information, and then we present a preliminary budget at the December Finance Committee meeting. And then it is brought to the December board meeting for approval to display and advertise. And then it is brought again at the January board meeting for final preliminary approval. And at that time, the board authorizes the district to file for referendum exceptions. And then between February and May, all the legwork happens where we really review everything and tighten up the budget as much as we can. And then at the May Finance Committee meeting, we will present a final proposal, bring that to the board for approval for public inspection. And then the final budget adoption is set to be on June 29th. So in summary, the district has implemented several cost efficiencies over the past year. However, 75% of our expenditures are contractually obligated, which limits our flexibility. Fixed costs continue to rise beyond our revenue. The Act 1 exception provides flexibility as the district and the board continues evaluating the budget. And the final tax rate will not be determined until June. So our goal tonight was to provide some context and transparency around the factors shaping that budget. This slide has some links to some resources. I did link the information for the millage, equalized millage, as well as the 23-24 per pupil expenditure that was pulled from PDE. I also included this senior tax reduction incentive, which is something we started planning a few years ago. It just never became finalized, so we are currently working on it to make it a policy for seniors to apply and receive a tax reduction incentive. And before I wrap this up, I just want to take a moment to recognize how special New Hope-Solebury is. Our district is recognized as one of the top school districts in Pennsylvania. I think the high school is rated number 4 out of the state right now. That reputation comes from our academic excellence, dedicated teachers and staff, and the benefits of being a smaller district with small class sizes, where students receive more individualized attention. Families move into this community because they know their children will receive an excellent education here. I know that personally because I was one of those parents who moved here 8 years ago to give my son a better education because he was struggling in another district. And he has flourished and he's doing great. And it's not just me, there's a lot of parents that feel the same way. The decisions we make in the budget ultimately support that mission, ensuring that we continue providing that high quality education this community values. So thank you very much. And does anyone have any questions?